Welcome, folks, to Ask Strong Towns Anything. My name is Norm. I'm excited to be able to welcome you, especially if you're watching this afterwards. Thanks for doing this. And did you know, if you're a Strong Towns member, you can join us live every week for these calls, because we take time to talk about the things that are going on in our communities and think through them from a Strong Towns perspective. So I have a number of questions that are keyed up, but Raleigh, you're asking about, why don't you introduce your question, Raleigh, right away on the 50-year mortgage?
It strikes me as a stupid idea, except for people in my position, so you can make your kids pay for your house. But particularly if Edwin or Chuck were here, they gave us their books insights on that sort of thing. I think it's pouring fuel on the fire, right? The more financialization rather than more supply.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think that's here. I'll drop a link to the article that Chuck wrote on this last week as well. And that took off. That was an article that a lot of people took notice of, partly because he said, in my book, I predicted that this would be coming. And if we make it easier for more people to access more money, to pay more for housing, none of those three things are going to result in affordability. Now, if we can have more people buying housing, yes, because there's more housing available, that checks out. If we have more people borrowing more, that actually does the opposite, which is you continue to broaden your base, which means that your potential pool of buyers continues to grow for upmarket products. And the trouble with that is then all of a sudden that puts so much of the impetus into the market to say, well, keep building that rather than anything that is below it. If any store that I walk into in the mall, I know that I can actually buy something there, the mall's tenants are going to shift from any of your like low level like Winners or Marshalls or whatever versions you guys have in the States. It will become like, why not sell this? And you see this even with, like, my favorite example is eyeglasses. I had a pair of Gucci eyeglasses. Why? Because insurance covered the cost, so I could pay more for frames. And as a result, there's this really weird thing where people are walking around in Prada like glasses, and yet everything else is like humdrum sort of, I'm wearing my regular Walmart stuff, and yet I've got like this high-end brand. And I think we've created the conditions in which we have said housing should have that same function. But Raleigh, you're really invested in housing and the industry. Do you want to share a little bit more? And then I'd love other people's reactions. I mean, I've shared what Chuck's reaction to it is, and just the concern that there can be this sense of like, well, housing security really matters. Let's get people into home ownership. But is it actually home ownership if your marginal sort of growth in principal is so minimal over over a 50-year span? You will eventually get there. But like, what does that do as we see even the fact that in Canada, we have pretty strict stress tests on our mortgages. You need to be able to prove that you can qualify and continue to pay for a mortgage that is, I think 3 to 4% points higher on interest rates, is you have to have that proven capacity. The realtors hated it. They said, this is awful. You're preventing people from getting into the market. And the Canadian government, to their credit, said, no, we are actually helping them to make sure they don't enter into a market they're not ready for. And that was the contrast. Whereas I believe in the States, there is far less of that kind of stress testing, which means any nominal increase in interest rates, which actually is a really important tool to manage the economy, results in just like this tipping point for so many households that suddenly are at risk. But Raleigh, what about in your analysis around 50-year mortgages for those that are just joining us? We're chatting about the shift or the recommendation from the presidency for the establishment now of extended terms for mortgages. And Raleigh, you're in Austin, if I have that right,
Yeah.
but certainly involved in a
Yes.
lot of housing stuff.
We are, and Austin is actually making some steps. They've created zoning that allows up to 4 houses on a single lot and much more acceptability of ADUs and all that. I am convinced by Chuck's book and my own, and Ed's book, Chuck and Ed's book, my own analysis, that the problem is supply, not demand, and that what we need is a lot more cheap housing. And I've actually made a couple runs. I finally found someone on how Strong Towns members could add to the financing on the supply side. Some kind of vetted system so we can invest in individual developers, ideally in our own community, without our having to do all the vetting. That there would be some established, these people have a good track record, sort of a better business rating or the equivalent of a customer reports rating on small scale developers, so we can get behind them with our money, as well as time and support and all that. And I remain convinced that the answer lies on the supply side, not the demand side. Sort of the opposite of the solution to the transportation problem,
Right.
from the strong towns perspective.
Mhm.
And now I'll be quiet and let others speak.
No, I appreciate that. And especially if there are things that you can do to deleverage a lot of the supply side, because leveraged supply of housing is much of it is, financed through additional debt and sort of overextension of like large firms. And so then they have to get a very high rate of return. And it's not greed so much as just survival. But the trouble is the level at which you need to make a turn of profit in order to survive. Creates a very different dynamic. Whereas your small scale local developer, if they can do small things, they will often sell on the market because they just need to move on to the next home. They're not holding any of their product because they need that funding to be able to run into the next project and stay busy. And that's the difference with all of the condo projects in my area that we're counting on to increase our housing supply. They're stuck because the moment that interest rates started to go slightly up and any kind of a tailwind came, or a headwind came into the economy, they just hit pause because they can afford to do that. It will hurt their margin more if they put those products into market. So they just hold back. So we need the people that are just like, oh, right now, I'll still sell to you. And that's the opportunity that we desperately need. Adam in Sudbury, and we're talking 50-year mortgages. Dropped a couple of links there. Kip, maybe I'll have you introduce the small change in a moment as well. But Adam, your thoughts?
Yeah, I really like what Raleigh said there, and also I think clarifying into it later in about, you mentioned cheap housing, but cheap housing by way of supply, and supply means that diverse zoning that we can do with mixed use. And so I really appreciate that you're showing us that it's that bigger picture, and it frustrates me when it's just like, well, we'll just lower prices on this. And unfortunately, the housing market is so expensive, certainly here in Canada as well. Despite our safeguards, as Norm had mentioned, our stress tests were great. We did weather the 2008 financial storm decently. But oftentimes we see what happens with those is that now still only the wealthy can afford it, and now they're getting a subsidy from it. So I think that was a good point. Something else I'm curious about too, with this concept of the 50-year mortgage and bigger picture financially, how's that going to influence specifically the US debt landscape, given that right now the bellwether for mortgages is rather the 10-year yield, shifting it to a 50-year yield? That sounds awfully risky. And given the fact that banks and other financial institutions are still engaging in collateralized debt obligations, which we saw was the pooling of mortgages, which is one of the many things that led to that 2008 financial crisis. So just some of my observations.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And it creates the another perverse reality that by extending sort of your window into which you need to pay back to 50 years, you also increase the amount of money up front that you can potentially put towards a home. So down payments, and people find secondary loans or secret loans to be able to even cover those costs. And then all of a sudden, the benefit is you can buy the house that you want rather than maybe the only house that's available. The flip side of it is bigger homes, more expensive. More expenses add up. And now all of a sudden you have a ton of people that are very sensitive to any kind of property tax increase, very sensitive to sort of the broader landscape of like any kind of increases in inputs, inflationary increases in the cost of repairs, the cost of just like upkeep and maintenance results in just a much deeper financial fragility. And so I know that there are things I need to be protected against. And sometimes that is a bad investment. I know not to buy a horse because I can afford a horse tomorrow, but I can't afford its upkeep. And I can't afford everything that goes along with trying to be a horse person as well. And trying to like keep up with the Joneses who have 3 horses. I mean, Raleigh, you're down in Austin, you're shaking your head. You're like, everybody should own a horse. But the reality is like, we actually have at times this challenge of, I mean, I don't want to be paternalistic, but there is that like recognition. The reason why you have defined periods in which you're looking to get that payout is partly so that banks can move on to the next thing. And this is one of those areas that when we share the Housing Trap book with people, most people don't fully appreciate that the initial stages of lending, if you lent at 3% and interest rates went up to 4%, the bank was like, oh no, we've got all of these low producing loans on our books. We could be in the market for better loans. So we're actually going to be careful. We're going to hedge our bets, limit the amount of lending that we do at the lower rate, because we basically want the interest rate to bump back up, and then we can basically do better on loans. By the government stepping in and backstopping all those loans and just taking them off their books, essentially, it created a condition which flow just becomes the core. Just get money out the door and then reassign. Money out the door, reassign. And so then you get these systems of, well, your commission and your value comes in the transaction, not in the loan. Well, that's very different. And that's a very pernicious type of incentive that kicks in there as well. And so, I mean, as we think about what do we do about it, I definitely picking up on small change. I definitely recommend checking out smallchange.co that Kip has mentioned there.
Yeah, so I've worked with the Incremental Development Alliance, and I've invested via smallchange.co because I think it's a great platform that I think it's called Eve Pickering started in order to just give local direct investment to small scale real estate developers. In fact, there's also there's one guy in Phoenix, Arizona. His name is Joe, and he's Incremental Development alumni or Alliance alumni, and he just posted his project for anybody who wants to invest in his project. But also the other link I added was the Rhode Island Community Investment Cooperative, which is instead of a project by project basis like smallchange.co is, this is more of a crowdfunding source that doles it out to 10 or 20 small scale developers in the Providence area. And it could be small scale projects like $20,000, or it could be a duplex or a threeplex.
It's even systems that said we will provide an upfront loan with an extended repayment period just for developer fees. A lot of small scale developers just find that they cannot, like, the cash flow doesn't work if some of those upfront permit fees that the cities have are charged and expected to be paid right away. There's and it's as you were talking about, like the small scale loans, like it's almost going back to like programs that have flourished in Africa and India of like micro loans, and realizing, oh, that mechanism actually has the capacity to help in our communities as well, because of that same sense of local empowerment, local skill development, local opportunity being harnessed through that. And certainly we see that in some of our communities. My concern is our big cities are they feel like they're beyond that, even though ironically, neighborhood by neighborhood, we could actually see that resurgence occur within those spaces as well. So I promised to put a 5-minute timer myself. I was like, all right, 5 minutes for a question. We could capture more. That may not necessarily be the case. I want to put out a question. I will post a question here that someone asked, because I'm going to need to crowdsource this one to the rest of you. But then what I also wanted to say is, if you've got questions in your pocket, let's definitely take it up. But Danny in Maryland is looking for advice, really appreciating the podcast, and said they wanted to know data on the percentage of San Francisco homes, or pardon me, single family homes in their city that are owned by corporate landlords, as well how to obtain for the city and county annual information on how much average and median rent is changing. This is something that's sort of at the perimeter of my skill set. But in terms of the first one, the most successful group that we know that helps with that is Regrid. But we did a whole session with Alex Alsop, a local motive session that I will send to Danny if anybody else is interested, where Regrid is a firm out of Detroit, and they basically take a look at every parcel. Alex just said, I love parcels. And it's it's the lowest sort of increment which land is distributed within the communities and within the country. And they try their best to, like, if somebody's address is out of state, they will count that as sort of an out of state owner. But corporate landlords, that can take the version of a doctor that has an LLC that owns one house, all the way up to your BlackRocks or your big, firms that are doing that. But does anybody else have more technical response that would be useful here? So again, the two questions, and then on the rent, that's something that most communities do track. But I think that the data is pretty spotty on that. Anybody have done a secret master's thesis on this, or do this as your side hobby or as your day job that wants to jump in? Yeah, Raleigh, good point. I said each local property assessor's office has data on ownership, but as it can be said, I'm trying to paraphrase. That as I said, the data can be definitely misleading. Someone asked, even with like Urban 3, the work that they do, like, oh, a lot of this is available online. It's like, yes, but you have to do the cleanup work or the qualification of the data in order for it to make sense.
I sent a question in my email. Do you want me to?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, sure. Hey, everyone. My name's Dave. I'm from Canada, in the province of Ontario, and I live in a small rural town, 2 hours northwest of Toronto. We're the only rural chapter of Strong Towns in our province. So all the major cities have chapters, and we're only about 1,500 people. Like, it's a really tiny town, but we have a water tower and we have sewage, which means we are a target settlement area for growth. And because we're so small, like, there isn't really opportunities for infill. We can't really grow up instead of out. Like in a tiny town of 1,500 people, we're not going to start building, 7-8 story mid-rises. There are a few empty parking lots downtown, which are scheduled for, 4-story, which is great. But thousands of people are supposed to be moving here in the next 10, 15 years. So it's going to be greenfield subdivisions. So what I'm trying to do is to find resources of, if subdivisions are coming on farmland and it's unstoppable, how do you do it right? How do you do it? How do you get mixed density, mixed use, mixed income, walkable, small businesses, local retail, all that? And I find that it seems to be a bit of a blind spot for our entire movement. The focus is so much on build up, not out. I can't find good resources of, if you're building out, how do you do it right? So we only have 7 members of council. It's really accessible. Lobbyists don't really have a big impact out here because it only costs $3,000 to run a campaign for council because it's so small. So they're really open to new ideas. We're going through a zoning bylaw review, and that'll be followed by an official plan review. They're going over the development guidelines right now. And I'm at a loss because I can't find best practices for smart growth, greenfield subdivisions. That's my question.
Kelly's sharing a book, Starting Your Own Backyard, transforming. You'll have to unmute and read the subtitle.
It's Start in Your Own Backyard by Steve Nygren. I couldn't spell Serenbe quick enough, but he's doing that exact same work. He's taking farmland and putting housing on the farmland and incorporating both. So making both of them work together.
Yeah.
So that way you have the mixed use and a little bit more density, but also saving and protecting the farmland and places for people to grow the food. So
okay, yeah.
It's a great project. I haven't finished reading the book. I have another one that's on top of my list, but yeah, so as far as what I've heard, it's really good project.
Cool, thank you. I'll look into that. Starting in your own backyard?
Yeah, start in your own backyard.
Okay, cool.
Definitely recommend that. I also, couple questions. Do you have any like 2-story or 3-story structures like in the core of your community?
Yeah. Our downtown was built pre-1960s. So we have 2 blocks of amazing small shops with rentals above, but I can't find any examples in the last half century where people are building that type of Main Street built form in rural areas as we expand small villages.
Right. And I think that would be, one of the opportunities is if you are stirring up a local conversation to say, how do we get some of the property owners to just like catch the bug? Because this work in Serenbe, Georgia, the part of it was the recognition, like we we grieve the loss of sort of natural areas and farmland, and yet simultaneously take the check. Now you actually have a lot of opportunity as the seller, to say, like, actually, what if I wanted to set in motion a requirement, that the development occur in certain ways or meet certain performance standards. But that only it cannot be asked belatedly. And this is often when we'll be like, we talked to the seller and they just said, well, there's nothing I can do. This bill's already signed. It's like trying to get them early. That would be one of those like voluntary approaches rather than looking for legislation to be brought in to be like, we are going to define the form and character of all of these places. Because you're right, it has to be through the establishment of new village cores, and that have their own distinct sort of like nucleus to them, that we could actually see this begin to emerge. The flip side of it is, I appreciate what you're saying of like, we're not likely to build up, when we just have all of this land available as like the escape valve. The lot sizes in your community of 1,500 are probably smaller than what your new builders would be looking to build on.
Yeah.
The trouble is, like, when we talk about like building up, we actually mean even just to that next story. So that's that next increment, and trying to, there are probably a dozen to 24 restrictions in your current code, that you could restrict. I mean, that you could remove. Hitting the delete key is always a preference of mine, in order to say, let's at minimum make it so that it's not a zero pressure option to build in a farmland and maximum pressure or maximum brain damage option, to build in town. Let's find those ways for that to occur. The trouble is that you're dealing with some very entrenched interests who are just like, they're, in some sense, a lot of people in smaller communities are content if the development happens outside of their boundaries. They're just like, whatever, the rest of the countryside is changing, just don't change my little portion. We live just outside of St. George, Ontario, and St. George had this in spades, where they were allowing all of these barnacles to be added to the outermost reaches. And then there were all of these problems that the town just didn't function well anymore because it was choked up with traffic. But it was, at least we don't have those new homes in our existing neighborhoods. And that's a tough, and I think that's where, speaking about the financial performance of places, I did a presentation of the Marmora and Lake Economic Development Committee, and I just showed them their value per acre performance, from right in their town versus out in the outskirts. They have 18 bridges they need to repair. I said, how are you going to do that except if you have development that is as at least as productive as what your ancestors built? And if you can't match that,
we showed a video to council about how the subdivisions, the low density subdivisions, especially over time with repair costs, like capital repair costs down the road, that it's actually like a money loser over time. I think they were receptive to that.
Yeah. And it is driving that, like, there are a new set of standards that we're going to hold projects to, but also that we're going to expect of our community or gain credibility for in our community. And I think that's the shift that a local conversation can be really helpful with. Even at minimums, getting people who are like, I do care about this, but not just in a, I'm going to reject everything way, but in a way of saying, like, I know what a healthier approach looks like for our community.
Yeah, so again, I would echo those same sentiments. I think it's great that you're acknowledging this, and I'm curious too. Now, what I liked about it was you also cited water infrastructure. So I imagine you're familiar with the whole debacle with Farquhar Strickland in Northern Ontario, where that happened, where the town, whether or not they officially declared bankruptcy or not, it looks like this could well lead them down a similar path. So I think leading with that as one, a cautionary tale, while working with the council like you have and talking about these progressive zoning policies. I know it's a smaller town, and anytime we bring up, your bigger cities, your Edmontons, your Ottawas, and that go, oh, those are big cities, they don't do that. But Edmonton has been pushing forward some pretty progressive zoning policies, and I guess it's kind of finding that balance with that. And I'm wondering how open our local councils are to changing that, or how we influence zoning and shifting from that kind of that Euclidean zoning, single use zoning, to a much more mixed use zoning idea to densify and thicken up.
So we're actually going through a zoning bylaw review right now. They've hired an outside consultant. Our Strong Towns chapter sent a formal submission with 30 recommendations based on Strong Towns principles. She already had all the good stuff in there about the downtown, like having a Main Street zone that, has encourages, 4 or 5, even 6 stories, retail on the floor, 0 setback. Where I felt she was really lacking was the zoning for new developments. I still felt that it fell into like everything's either residential zone or commercial zone, which to me is going to lead to,
Yeah.
hundreds of acres of sprawl and then 100 acres of big box and then sprawl, big box, sprawl, big box. And I was like, why isn't there a development growth zone that is explicitly like village, like a village zone or a neighborhood zone that has Main Street forms built into the zoning? And I think that was just too much. It was too big of a leap for her. And I wasn't able to find a precedent anywhere of a zone that is, maybe I just wasn't looking in the right spot, but I can't find a municipal zone that isn't for a downtown. It's for greenfield development, but it explicitly mandates a walkable village style in the subdivision.
And I'm curious if that even exists simply because we've been bound to this single use zoning for so long that no one's bothered
Yeah.
to think outside the box.
Yeah.
We've actually had the time to now see the negative side effects of it, which is where we are now exactly. We've seen the sprawl, we've seen the traffic,
Right.
plus the sheer costs. Like
I
it's
mean,
I don't know about you, but when I watch a zoning debate on something, people aren't necessarily opposed to the change in zoning. It's they don't want their kids getting hit by a car because they know that's what's inevitably going to happen, but no one's having that conversation.
right.
So it's almost like, and on the one hand, yeah, you don't have that precedent to push it, which would give you a foundation to stand on, but you also don't have that restriction. So you can be like, hey, we have a great opportunity. Here's what happens when we continue with sprawl. Look at what happened with Farquhar Strickland. We could run into the same issue here because we wouldn't be able to afford it. Let's make this change. And I'm wondering if visual aids and data from like the Urban 3 showing the prosperity of your downtown core to say this is a model that we need to replicate.
Right. Yes. What's the municipality you keep referring to? Parkhurst Strickland?
Yeah, Farquhar Strickland. Also, it's a CBC article. Am I okay to post this in the chat there, Norm?
Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure. And we'll come to Chris in just a moment here. Great discussion. But I did also want to briefly share this image that I refer to fairly often because this is the city of Medicine Hat, so a much larger city. But they basically built it. They created this map, which is based on the current primary building, what year it was built. And what's so interesting is you can see all of the sort of rings that are built out. And they were really troubled because they said, this little neighborhood here and this here on the other side of the river, like, did we get it right? Because there's so many different colors that are present there. And we're like, no, that is exactly that means, you as the city back in the day got it right by allowing for a lot of that shift, a lot of that change to occur. And what's happened in the suburban development pattern is you get a lot more of this. Everything is static. Everything is sort of like as it is. And very little modification is even permitted. And that's a major contrast. And that will be the like cultural shift that your community leaders would need to take is, are we actually like content? Because you can then do that type of work to help that occur in your community. Last thing I'll mention too is a lot of the farm fields are just done under a single sort of master plan. So the master plan community ironically a tool that both cities and builders use because they know that none of the existing documents apply well. And so they basically put it between, and it becomes a matter of negotiation back and forth. Hey, they say, we'll offer a little bit of retail and we'll stick it at the corner. Corners should not be where, at the like periphery. That should not be where the retail goes. It should be in the heart of the community.
Right.
There should be, a recognition of that. But the trouble is like our brains have just been so distorted by the last number of years that we just don't have the ability to do that. So awesome stuff. Yeah.
Anyone done it? Has anyone is there an example somewhere of a recent master planned subdivision on farmland in a rural area where there is walkable retail in the middle, there's mixed density, purpose-built rentals? Like, who got it right?
One place to check out is Southlands here in Delta, British Columbia. The Century Group, they have built a great neighborhood. It's featured in a CNU article. I can pull that up while we hear Chris's question as well. That's definitely worth checking out because and ironically or interestingly, they did the small things right. They have a coffee shop right in the core of the community. They actually subsidized the rent for the coffee shop in the early stages. The developer said every dollar that we spent subsidizing the rent of the coffee shop, we have recouped in improved property prices. Even the little cottages that they built as like a cluster of courtyard cottages, they expected those go for about 800,000. Yes, our numbers are crazy here. Those went for over $1 million because the demand is there. So if you want to ask, like, can we make money with this? Absolutely. Can we build a great community? Like, it's a place that people will now like bike to and just go for walks because it actually feels right. And that would be one example.
Can you post a link if
yeah.
you have anything? Thank
Yeah,
you. That
for sure.
sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
Wow. First of all, we really got to develop a village zone. I think that's so important. So I don't even know where to begin. What I really would like to see, and I'm impressed with the experience that's in this group. I did not expect to find this. I'd like to see something like the equivalent of a crash analysis studio for a community because I live in a little town called Brisbane. We're in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm directly south of the San Francisco border. That's how close I am to within this dense area. It's in the foothills of the San Bruno Mountain, which you might be familiar with as being the first place where the Environmental Protection Act was tested, and it failed because what they did is they came up with this concept of a habitat conservation plan, which is like, we're going to build where the butterflies are, but we're going to save this space over here and expect the butterflies to relocate themselves in this location. So it's a troubled kind of environment. 4,800 people in town. There's a central Brisbane, there's a large warehouse district, and then there's the more recent development, single family homes, lots of space between them, up on the ridge. So we're already suffering from this bifurcated community. Adjacent to all of this, and on the other side of a major road, major in the sense of a lot of very fast traffic, is the former San Francisco dump, landfill. Essentially, the origins of Brisbane is the San Francisco earthquake in 1906, because it began here with little earthquake cottages as people rebuilt their homes in San Francisco. A lot of debris from the earthquake, the city dump, additional toxic dump that happened subsequent to that. So there's lots of landfill over there, and they want to build. We've already got them to reduce the size of it, but 2,200 units of housing. Remember, the population of Brisbane is 4,800. They want to essentially double the population of the city with a single development. Bring in commercial that would bring in 18,000 people a day to the office. And we're struggling because, as you know, there's a lot of pressure to bring housing into communities. And we're going, you don't understand what the impact of this is going to have on us. And it's a brownfield, as I was indicating. What I've just described is a real short description. It's even more intricate than that. But I don't even know where to begin. I'll just toss it out there. And if anybody's got some ideas, I'd really appreciate it.
The starting point, and you touched on this, is that this is partly the consequence of the area experiencing intense pressures in terms of housing needs. The investment viability, kept growing. So the amount of money that was available to like begin to start projects, and a lot of the local restrictions resulted in the lack of ability to meet any of that need locally, sort of, continued insistence on single detached houses rather than any kind of like backyard. And so all of that pressure has built, and now you get these eruptions. And I've had to reconcile in my own community that we're going to have to account for every so often seeing these eruptions of dense, dense is not the right word. It's ill-fitted sort of projects. And yet this is where I think the need is, like, how do we then create the conditions in which people are able to say, if we are still going to proceed with a project like this, how do we make sure that it has like its own vitality? How do you, if our ancestors would build towns of 500 people with 2,200 households, we should be able to do a ton of that. So the challenges in Santa Clarita, for example, they built 3,000 homes right adjacent to the highway with no retail. And so you have to get on the highway, which is supposed to be used for interstate transfers. And instead, you're using that for your local commute to the Costco. The other element of it is the economics of brownfield rehabilitation are wild. The trouble may be that the process is already well underway. They've already paid enough in remediation consultant reports and things like that, or they haven't even started. Okay. I mean, there can be that challenge that like all of a sudden that the cycle of this being a certain thing going ahead begins to kick in. And in those cases, I think one of the asks or the strategies is not to necessarily seek to block the whole thing, but to ask, how do we remediate impacts? How do we see better outcomes from this? How do we push for improvements, not just as like a fraction of the project, but like that at the core of the project is a commitment to walkability. A core of the project allows for diverse retail. The flip side of it is, we have large scale developments here where the expectation of the builders of any commercial units is that they're leased to franchises that have at least 3 locations. So they have a very different picture of what it takes to build a viable community. For them, they're like, we need known entities that have a proven track record of success, which are like, okay, but there's no sense of being an incubator, no sense of like creating anything distinct or unique. And the other need is there a way in which, your community can say, well, what are we doing internally to make sure that like our streets are protected from becoming thoroughfares? Well, there's actually probably a lot that you could do with that. Small things like reducing posted speed limits to allow for curb bump outs and all of those things, so that we see places like in New Jersey where they said we are right next to New York City, but that doesn't mean we have to be a car sewer because of that. So they just said we are going to make sure that our streets serve our people, and as people maneuver through them, even if there's congestion, that actually creates the viability for other forms of transportation to become more compelling until you get to that point. And yeah, so that is definitely one of the factors. Dave, why don't you jump in, and then others as well?
Austin, Texas is in fact a poster child for trying to deal with all that. I would give them a B or a B minus, but well above a C or D, but not quite an A in all the things the council's really tried to do to some of the things have been great. They preserved wilderness areas. They've now allowed for many more units per place. They're big fans of the 3+1, retail on the first floor, housing above it. The mistakes are they're doing it linearly. So it gets all stretched out along thoroughfares, which makes it really hard to do either mass transit or walking, because it's all stretched in 2 dimensions, not what Chuck recommends is you allow it to thicken on the sides. So there's the new zoning plan adopted last year, maybe the year before, kind of is full of stuff for people to look at that, if Austin did it, maybe we can, maybe you can. We've also had very rapid growth in the fringes that just outside of Austin, including like Georgetown. And those places played very mixed reviews on what they've done. Some of them, like Georgetown, have done pretty well. The others, there are vast stretches of McMansions on large lots with no retail within miles. So not perfect by any means, but a lot of good going on in a larger city.
Mm-hmm. And I wish that we had effective ways to make that translation happen, because sometimes people in smaller communities are sort of like, they look at what the larger communities are doing and say, well, that doesn't apply here. And there can be that automatic discounting and this is, I think, CNU has been such an important force in the landscape of saying, like, here are your core principles that should apply no matter the size of the community. If we get these core elements right, we don't even need studies to show us that these are the like right principles. These are just things that are intuitive to what it takes to build flourishing communities. And now let's get to that stage as we go with it. Chris, maybe a question for you is, what level, like, what is the nature of the, not pushback, but sort of the community defense, or sort of the activities that are there? Because some are just like, no change. We want things to remain as they are. And I've always said, then you are choosing for your place just to become more exclusive and expensive. That is the like strangling exclusion, just catching up with more and more people. But so long as you're not the person being strangled, you feel like, well, it hasn't come for me yet. The flip side of it is like a complete, capitulation, which is just whatever, it's beyond our reach. We can't do anything about it. What has been sort of the nature of the conversation to date?
Well, it's interesting. The development actually started out with about 4,400 units of housing. We got that pushed down. That was in 2013. And now they've taken their time about coming back. In the meantime, San Francisco put a great deal of pressure on Brisbane, actually threatening to annex the city.
Okay. Yeah.
Because they wanted the project to just go forward. Interestingly, there is a portion that's in the city of San Francisco. The developer could be building that. San Francisco has approved it. The developer's not doing anything there. My concern is actually that for our piece of it, which is much larger, that they're actually not going to have enough funds to finish the job. And we're going to be sitting with one of those, as you know, like down in LA, there are these partially built constructions that then just stopped. The developer also has a lot on another part of Brisbane called Sierra Point, which is entirely business. There's no residential out there, and the marina. And they haven't begun that. That's been approved. They can be moving forward with that. So we're kind of wondering what's going on with this developer. The town is a little afraid that they're going to be left holding the bag either now or at some point in the future, particularly if they walk away, leaving us. They started doing things that we don't trust. For example, part of remediation involves capping. They've just been dumping soil, which is not the same thing as proper capping, on the land over the last 10 years. It's grown. So I guess to answer your question is for the most part, there are a handful of people who are just gung-ho, let the development go. But for the most part, the community is very cautious and concerned. Because it also, remember I described the bifurcation? This is another part of town that will have no relationship to the core of the city. So we don't understand what it's going to do to the city of Brisbane.
Yeah. I mean, my perception would be that perhaps there are funds available that are sunsetting if no movement is happening. So that's why they're taking action on this site rather than, working on another site that they might own or have under ownership. The reality that it's essentially establishing yet another community, to me, would be one of the areas to really lean into, like to say it doesn't have to be Brisbane for it to belong. It can be like its own distinct sort of, enclave. The trouble, from a strong town's perspective is you're trying to build it all at once to a finished state, rather than having any of the early stages of the increments of, what could this look like as it began. They also probably are not going to get the street grid right to really like work well as a holistic community. But at minimum, you can begin to just say, how does this create like a state of independence? What would that look like for, instead of annexation, for de-annexation to occur within, 5 years, that this could be not just under HOA control, but actually under municipal control. And if I were the developers on a complicated site like that, I would be looking to establish a municipality there, do the Disney thing, which is create the municipality, load it up with some of the infrastructure requirements, take out a bond for that, which is, this is not what I would do as a strong townsperson. This is what I would do as like a developer, but load up the municipality with the infrastructure requirements, and you can take out significant bonds at municipal rates to be able to do that. all the while establishing sort of a very simple structure of city governance over that land. So the strategy is de-annex it, and create the conditions in which now all of a sudden you have a partner municipality with the developer. Disney did this by only, and Starbase is another example of this. I'm not picking great examples, am I? But they are so committed to like plunging ahead with this larger scale development. I'm fascinated, but I think we'll have Tim will bring you in a moment here, is just what were the conditions that created the drop from 4,400 units down to 2,200? Because
community pressure.
But who made the decision or the determination that that was necessary then? Like, is that a legal stance, or that's actually just the developer came back and said, oh, we're going to reduce it by half?
Well, the community had identified a lot of technical reasons for not doing that as well. And I think the biggest problem is that the developer's kind of opaque to us. They're foreign.
Right.
And communication's difficult.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure I'm answering your question. It was pushback on the initial draft EIR that sent them back to do a redesign.
Okay. Yeah. Because I'm always worried about the perception of victory when like unit counts just drop, because that also means the available resources to build the project begin to be cut in half. If it's a halving of the number of sellable units, either the lot sizes are going to be larger, the homes are going to be more out of reach, and some of the creativity gets pulled away. The flip side of it is I'd need more of the landscape there. But Tim, you're down in Georgia, but
Just
you're
a second.
One more. Yeah.
But what I'm sitting with is, well, what if the answer is that the fact is that there is nothing that you can build there that you can afford to build there, given all of those conditions?
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility. Yeah. And I'm noting here in the chat, Raleigh, you mentioned about the developer that had a practice of raising a large amount of funds for a project and then running away and keeping the upfront money. That is, yeah, you said it's a novel, but actually I would imagine that's there's stranger stories in reality than even what you could come up with. What about for you, Tim?
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I'm down here in Georgia, and I might as well be up in Ontario or out in California. It really wouldn't matter. I think these problems are throughout all of North America. What's interesting in our area now, I live near Warner Robins, Georgia, but also near Perry, Georgia. Perry's an older community, and is a lot more active right now, with a lot of people complaining about the development that's occurring, a lot of greenfield development occurring, and you have an older downtown. But what I observe in my area in general is that even when we do get the land use right, and we actually get it right a lot, if you drive around, you pay attention to what you have in the area. When we get the land use right, we almost never, actually, I would say never, have gotten the transportation planning right. So, for example, within a mile of my house, and when I moved to my house in 2006, I wasn't thinking in terms of urbanism. I was thinking in terms of my family and a house. Never even thought about it. But I'm 1 mile from a grocery store. I could get there on a sidewalk, but also in that area, you have everything, the makings of an incredible village center, multiple restaurants, hardware, movie theater, grocery store, everything is there. But to get there, I can get there on a bike, but to get there in any other way than driving is just kind of absurd to most people. And as there's a lot of pressure to develop the farmland in and around that area. I'll give you an example. There's a brand new apartment complex with hundreds of apartments that's sitting behind the Lowe's. And the only way to get from that apartment complex to the Lowe's and the movie theater and the multiple restaurants that are in this strip center is to come out of the apartment complex, take a right turn, go down Highway 96, which is a state highway, make a U-turn, go up to the traffic light, and make a left turn into the shopping center. And so, when I try, and of course, I'm reading that book that I think a lot of us are reading, The Love Letter to Suburbia now. And so, the idea of villages has kind of fascinated me for a while. I just don't know how to communicate this idea of the transportation. I also, let me just tell you, I'm pretty privileged. I spent a lot of time in Atlanta, very close to the Beltline, probably the best urban trail in the country. I also my mom lives in Hilton Head, and have been in Hilton Head for personal reasons a lot over the last couple weeks. Spent a lot of time in Hilton Head, and Hilton Head is like Amsterdam. I remember going there in the 70s. There was not there were bike paths in the Sea Pines in the first developed area of Hilton Head, but there were not bike paths in Hilton Head before the 1990s. And now there are. You can get all over Hilton Head, which is interesting because Hilton Head is the same land use as a place like Warner Robins. Yet there's, hundreds, if not thousands of people out biking and walking and enjoying the outdoors. That's very interesting. The last thought I wanted to give regarding zoning is I was looking at the parking requirements and kind of the history of parking requirements in my county. And they were passed in 1976, which is right in the hot zone of when, like from the 1950s to the 1980s, communities were copying and pasting zoning codes across the country. I think my only hope is that maybe that'll happen again. But there is a lack of an AMSL adaptive reuse. I know about form-based codes, but I think we can hope that the zoning codes get passed. But if we don't fix the transportation planning along with the zoning codes, we're not going to get where we need to get.
Yeah. Although I will say what you described in terms of the circumstances to get to the Lowe's and the shopping center, that is one of those opportunities where if you could get the property owner to just do something like create a dignified way for people to access it on foot, you would actually give the opportunity for potentially people that say, oh, I could drive or I can get there. But, and I'm sharing here, this is in Kimberley, British Columbia. They had just a blank alley, but they had parking behind their Plotzel area, which is just a fantastic little space. So this is a little bit different where, this is clearly a place that you want to get to. But what they did with it is they just created a place, and the lights, there's a little like bench midway that you can actually just like hang out. They made it just a little bit safer. And I think when we talk about like doing the small things, it doesn't mean having a master plan for getting people from that new neighborhood to their shopping sort of services on foot. It just means making those small, modest improvements. And it would be interesting to see if behavior could change. I would say, sometimes the best pathfinding involves a bolt cutter, just cutting the fence open. And all of a sudden you will see people using it. And you're like, oh, you own 2 vehicles and yet you're slipping through a fence that we've cut open for you because there's that recognition. Well, I would walk, but I can't right now. Well, what if we found that way to make that happen? And Chris, I think that would be one of those things too. If like making sure there's a pedestrian path connecting, your 2 discombobulated areas, like not keeping them at bay to be like, we need them away. Say, we just don't need your cars. But let's get you here in every other way possible. Like that can be that, like, and over time, it feels like at first glance, you say like, are people going to actually do this? We have evidence all over the place that people will actually do pretty surprising things, so long as the time cost is not too high, the actual cost, the dollar cost is not significant, and the perceived sense of comfort or dignity is upheld. That's when we start to use transit. If time cost and actual cost and a sense of comfort are upheld, you begin to see people using bikes. You see people walking in greater numbers as soon as we can be. And those are things that are not static or sort of like, handed down to us by the gods. We can change those indicators gradually with small sort of token steps that begin to build up over time. Multi-use paths where you can deal with that. I had a whole question on scooters and what to do about them.
I would just say, I think that we in my community, what I'm pushing for is requiring these developments to have a connectivity plan that goes beyond the car. And that's kind of the key thing that would really help, because you have all the makings of a village center, but it's just not a village because you can't get there any other way but driving. Mm-hmm. And we're perfectly happy with the parking requirements, but it seems that any other requirements are out too much. So yep, excellent.
I appreciate that. We are here at the top of the hour. I am mindful of that. We all have lots of questions, lots of things. Chris, Steve mentioned in the chat, the Brownfield Redevelopment Resource, EPA.gov. Okay, perfect. You saw that. I will get the recording posted and also share the links in a resource page as well. Lively in the chat. Really appreciate that throughout the session today. I hope we touched on some things and at minimum got you fired up. We're all gonna have to go man the barricades with Chris or go and help and support Dave. So thank you all folks for jumping in today. And Kelly, is your puppy nearby? Because maybe people can see your puppy before we go. No, okay, too much.
Sorry, puppy's out using a potty break.
She has an adorable puppy, and so maybe at some point that will become our Ask Strong Towns Anything mascot. Until then, thank you for attending, and as always, thank you for being a Strong Towns member and being part of what we're doing here, helping each other. Really appreciate the back and forth today. Take care, folks.